Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, let us drift quietly into the 19th century, a world filled with change, yet also with traditions that continued to shape daily lives. As we take this gentle step into the past, our focus will not be on kings or rulers, nor on battles or politics. Instead, we will look closely at the lives of ordinary women, mothers, daughters, sisters, and neighbors who carried the rhythm of history in their everyday routines. Their stories are not always written in the grand pages of history, but they are the threads that held entire communities together. Tonight's journey is about them, about the strength found in simplicity and the beauty of daily life. How are you this evening? Perhaps you are winding down after a long day, or maybe you are lying comfortably in bed, ready to close your eyes. It feels soothing, doesn't it, to give yourself permission to pause and rest for a while. This story is here to keep you company, to guide your mind away from busyness and into a softer rhythm. May I ask, from which country are you listening right now? Perhaps you are in a bustling city where the streets are still awake with quiet noise. Or maybe in a small town where everything has grown still for the night. It could be very late, or it might be early morning where you are, as you prepare to finally let sleep take over. Wherever you may be, you are part of this calm circle of listeners, sharing the same gentle moment across different places. If you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, you may kindly press like or subscribe, so that you will not miss the next quiet story. And if you wish, you may also tap the little bell, so you will be gently reminded whenever a new tale is ready. These small gestures allow us to keep creating peaceful history for sleep. But whether you choose to or not, I want you to know that I am thankful for your time and your presence here tonight. Now let us quietly open the door to the 19th century. Imagine cobblestone streets under lantern light, the sound of horses' hooves echoing in the distance, and the steady rhythm of wooden wheels on stone. Inside the homes, fires crackle softly, bread is being prepared, and families gather in the warm glow of lamplight. Though industrial machines were beginning to reshape cities, in most households life followed familiar rhythms, anchored by the steady hands and patient endurance of women. Picture a small rural cottage, with whitewashed walls and a thatched roof, smoke curling gently from the chimney into the cool morning air. At dawn, a woman begins her day by tending the fire, preparing a simple meal, and making sure children or elders are cared for. She may feed chickens, draw water, or step into the garden to check on vegetables that sustain her family. These tasks may seem ordinary, but they were the foundation of life. Every loaf of bread, every blanket folded by the hearth, carried her unseen effort. In the crowded cities, life carried a different rhythm. A woman might wake not to the crow of a rooster, but to the sound of factory bells or carriages clattering across cobblestones. Instead of fields, she worked in small rooms, sewing, mending, or cooking with whatever supplies she could afford. Some took in laundry, others stitched garments for neighbors or for shops. The air smelled of coal, the streets buzzed with noise, but within each modest apartment, women created order and warmth, shaping small worlds of comfort amid the growing bustle. Clothing played an important part in daily life. Dresses were long and modest, often layered depending on the season: cotton or linen for warmer days, wool for the winter chill. Women took care to repair tears, let out hems, and repurpose fabric to make garments last. For most, clothing was not about fashion, but about endurance and dignity. To put on a clean dress, no matter how simple, was a quiet act of self-respect. The fabric itself had no power, but by the will of the Creator it gave warmth and protection. while women's skill and patience extended its life. Education also began to slowly reshape women's lives. Early in the century, many girls had little chance to attend school, but as decades passed, opportunities expanded. Some learned letters at home, guided by parents or grandparents, often using well-worn prayer books or simple readers. Later, community schools welcomed more girls, offering basic literacy, arithmetic, and sewing. For many women, reading became a gentle refugian evening with a candle, a journal tucked away in a drawer, or a borrowed book providing both comfort and knowledge. As we drift deeper into this journey, let us carry with us the image of these women, rising with the dawn, tending homes, protecting dignity through small daily acts, and quietly shaping the lives around them. They may not have filled the headlines of their time, but their presence sustained families and gave rhythm to a century in change. These are the lives we will walk alongside tonight, steady, quiet, and filled with resilience. As the morning hours passed, the routines of women shaped the heartbeat of the household. Their work might appear repetitive to an outside eye, yet every action carried meaning. Sweeping the floor, kneading dough, or folding laundry was not only about tidiness, but about providing comfort and dignity. Each task was a piece of quiet resilience, a way of creating a space where families could rest and feel cared for. It is in these small moments that the depth of women's contributions becomes visible, steady, and essential, though often unspoken. In rural villages, daily rhythms followed the seasons. Spring meant preparing gardens, planting seeds, and hoping for good weather. Summer brought long hours of tending fields, harvesting fruits, and preserving food for the colder months. Autumn was filled with storing crops, repairing homes, and ensuring everything was ready for winter. Winter itself was demanding, with the cold pressing against homes and families relying on stored supplies. Women carried these cycles patiently, their routines flowing in harmony with nature's changes. Meanwhile, in cities, the seasons shaped life differently. Summer meant crowded streets, with open windows letting in both fresh air and the noise of factories. Winter brought smoke-filled skies and the struggle to stay warm in cramped apartments. Women adapted to these changes, balancing limited resources against the demands of families. They stitched clothes to last through the chill, prepared meals from whatever was available, and kept homes steady against the noise and restlessness outside. Their work brought order to the unpredictable rhythm of city life. Beyond survival, there was also creativity. Women used scraps of fabric to make quilts, repurposed old garments into something new, and decorated their homes with small touches that made spaces feel welcoming. These acts of creativity showed that even within limitation, beauty could still be found. It was not about luxury, but about making the ordinary more bearable, more human. A well-stitched quilt, a simple vase of flowers, or a carefully prepared meal was a reflection of care, turning hardship into something softer. Friendship and community also colored these daily lives. Women often worked together, gathering for sewing circles, helping one another with harvests, or supporting neighbors in times of illness. These bonds made heavy tasks lighter and gave women strength when burdens grew too heavy to carry alone. Conversation, laughter, and shared effort brought connection into days that might otherwise feel isolating. In this way, resilience was not only individual but also collective, sustained by the ties of community. Faith, too, was woven into the daily rhythm. Many began and ended their days with prayer, giving thanks for sustenance and seeking strength for the challenges ahead. Religious gatherings provided moments of reflection and belonging, reminding women that their endurance had meaning beyond survival. These practices gave calm to weary minds, teaching patience and trust in the midst of hardship. Their devotion was steady, expressed not in grand gestures but in the quiet repetition of belief, shaping their character and guiding their families. Challenges, of course, were constant. Illness, poverty, and loss touched nearly every household. Women bore these hardships with remarkable patience, finding ways to continue despite sorrow or exhaustion. Their strength was not about avoiding difficulty, but about enduring it with grace. In caring for the sick, comforting the grieving, or managing a household in scarcity, they showed resilience that carried families forward. These struggles, though painful, revealed the depth of their perseverance. Children learned resilience through their mothers and grandmothers. They absorbed lessons of patience by watching chores done steadily, of kindness by seeing neighbors helped, of faith by hearing prayers spoken daily. These lessons shaped the next generation, ensuring that values were carried forward even in difficult times. Women became the quiet teachers of endurance, guiding children not only in skills but also in character. Their influence was not written in books, but lived out in everyday actions. Evenings were often the most peaceful time of the day. After work was done, families gathered by the fire. Women might mend clothes, prepare food for the next day, or tell stories to children. These moments were gentle, filled with warmth, despite the weariness of long labor. They offered a chance to rest, to reconnect, and to reflect. The quiet hum of a household in the evening was the sound of survival, of life carried forward through patience and care. And so, as we close this opening segment of our journey, we see the lives of women in the 19th century not as grand tales of power, but as steady rhythms of endurance. Their work shaped households, their devotion guided communities, and their resilience preserved traditions in a changing world. They remind us that history is not only about rulers or battles, but about the countless ordinary lives that carried humanity forward day after day, year after year. The home in the 19th century was more than a shelter. It was the stage upon which almost every part of life unfolded. From dawn until night, the house breathed with rhythm, alive with constant activity. Women moved from task to task, carefully tending to details that ensured their families could live in order and stability. In rural homes, the day began early, often with the sound of roosters outside and the chill of morning air drifting through the windows. Fires had to be coaxed into life again, bringing warmth back into the rooms. In city dwellings, the routines felt slightly different, yet no less demanding. Coal needed to be prepared, floors swept, and food arranged, even in small kitchens with limited supplies. No matter the setting, the home was a center of gravity, and women were its keepers, shaping daily existence through diligence and care. Step inside a small rural cottage, and you will notice how life centered around modest spaces. The walls might be simple, whitewashed and bare, with only a few shelves lined with jars or tools. The air carried the scent of herbs drying by the window, or of bread slowly baking near the hearth. At the center, a sturdy wooden table stood, scarred with years of use, where meals were shared, clothes repaired, and lessons quietly taught to children. The woman of the house guided every detail of this environment. She managed food carefully, measured supplies, and planned for days when the weather was harsh or the fields gave less. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of cloth, every leftover crumb, had a place or purpose. The home became a reflection of her skill and resourcefulness, quietly sustaining life without fanfare or recognition. In towns and cities, The atmosphere was different, yet the importance of home remained. Women lived in brick apartments, sometimes crowded, with narrow staircases and neighbors close on every side. Noise drifted in from the street's vendors calling out, carts rattling by, children playing in alleys. Inside, however, there was a constant effort to create peace and order. Even when space was tight, women managed to shape small corners of comfort. A clean cloth on the table, a candle lit in the evening, or a carefully folded blanket gave a sense of dignity. These touches may have seemed small, but they softened the hardness of city life. To create warmth where noise and smoke dominated required patience and imagination. It was through these quiet acts that homes in cities became sanctuaries, however modest, where families could gather and find rest at the end of long days. The hearth was one of the most important parts of the home. In rural cottages, it was the source of heat, light, and meals, drawing the family together in the evenings. In city apartments, coal stoves replaced open fires, but the principle was the same. The hearth was the center of warmth and nourishment. Women tended it with great care, balancing the need to preserve fuel with the demand for hot meals. Bread baked slowly, stews simmered for hours, and the smell of food filled the air, promising comfort. These meals, though simple, carried significance far beyond their ingredients. They were symbols of care, of labor made visible, of a woman's constant effort to sustain life around her. Yet the true giver of nourishment was the Almighty, who allowed food to grow and families to be sustained, while women's steady work made it ready for the table. Daily tasks were endless. Water had to be fetched, whether from wells in villages or pumps in towns. Clothes needed to be washed by hand, scrubbed and rinsed until clean, then hung to dry in the open air. Floors were swept or scrubbed, depending on the material, and children needed constant attention. Each day was a cycle of care, repeated again and again, often with little variation. But within these patterns, women carried immense responsibility. They ensured that households remained functional, that meals were on the table, that clothing was repaired, and that children felt secure. Their efforts stitched together the unseen fabric of daily life, making survival possible in times when conveniences were few. To step into a 19th century home was to witness this endless cycle, a quiet rhythm held together by diligence and endurance. One can imagine the soundscape of these homes, the rhythmic scrape of a broom across the floor, the bubbling of a pot over the fire, the soft chatter of children playing or a baby crying to be soothed. Outside, the sounds of animals or carriages blended with these quieter tones. Inside, everything felt closer, more intimate, with voices and sounds echoing in small rooms. For women, these sounds were companions as much as they were reminders of constant duties. They marked the hours of the day, guiding the flow of work from morning until evening. Even in silence, the presence of a home full of life was always felt, like an invisible heartbeat that pulsed steadily through each room. Light, too, shaped the rhythm of home life. In the mornings, sunlight spilled through small windows, guiding early chores. By evening, candles or oil lamps flickered in dim spaces, giving enough glow to cook, to sew, or to read a few lines before bed. Women carefully managed these sources of light, rationing candles to last, trimming wicks, and making sure lamps were safely tended. The glow of lamplight created a sense of calm, a softening of shadows as families drew closer together. While the lamps themselves offered light, it was only by the will of the Creator that such light benefited people, reminding them that comfort in darkness was a blessing not to be taken for granted. These small flickers carried homes through long nights, linking the passing hours with gentle steadiness. Furniture in these homes was often simple but purposeful. In rural cottages, a few wooden chairs, a table, perhaps a chest for storage, and simple bedding defined the household. In urban dwellings, apartments might contain iron bedsteads, narrow cupboards, and folding tables to save space. Women cared for these belongings carefully, polishing wood, patching mattresses, or repurposing old items when new ones could not be afforded. Every piece of furniture held a story of family gatherings around a table, of nights spent near a cradle, of mornings when blankets were folded neatly after rest. The house itself may not have been grand, but its furnishings reflected the care and perseverance of those who lived there. Through these objects, one could trace the imprint of daily life, made durable by steady hands and thoughtful stewardship. Gardens, too, played an important role in rural households. Women tended small plots of land, growing herbs, vegetables, and sometimes fruit. These gardens were more than decoration. They were lifelines, supplementing the household's meals and medicines. Each plant carried meaning, cared for with patience and knowledge passed down through generations. The food grown here was not merely the result of soil and seed, it was a provision allowed by the Almighty, who gave growth and benefit, while women's effort and attentiveness turned potential into sustenance. In cities, where space was scarce, women often grew herbs in pots or made use of courtyards, finding small ways to add freshness to their homes. These touches, whether in sprawling gardens or tiny windowsills, revealed a dedication to nurturing life wherever possible. At the heart of all this was the sense of responsibility women carried. Homes did not manage themselves. They required constant attention, creativity, and endurance. Women acted as organizers, caretakers, problem solvers, and teachers, often all in the span of a single day. Their work was quiet, largely unseen by those outside the home, yet it was essential. Without it, families would falter and communities would weaken. The dignity of this responsibility lay not in public recognition, but in the steady and unseen contributions that kept life turning. Each home was like a small world, and women, through daily routines, held that world together with patience and strength, leaving behind a legacy woven into the very fabric of society. In many households, routines were shaped not only by work, but also by the seasons. In the winter, days were shorter, fires burned longer, and tasks had to be adjusted to the lack of daylight. In summer, there was more activity, with washing hung in bright sunlight, windows open to catch breezes, and gardens requiring daily care. Women adjusted to these patterns naturally, weaving their work around the rhythm of nature. The seasons dictated how food was stored, how clothing was cared for, and how families prepared for the months ahead. Each shift required foresight, patience, and planning. Though much of this labor was repetitive, it reflected an incredible ability to adapt, to manage time and resources so that no family was left unprepared when weather turned harsh or supplies grew scarce. Children grew up within this environment, learning not only through instruction but by observation. Young girls watched their mothers mend, cook, or plan, and gradually absorbed the skills that would later sustain their own households. Boys learned, too, noticing the patience and resourcefulness needed to keep daily life steady. These lessons were passed quietly, without classrooms or formal teachers, but with lasting effect. Every act, sweeping, stitching, tending gardens, or preparing meals, was a kind of education, repeated until it became second nature. The home was both shelter and school, shaping the habits, values, and endurance of the next generation. It was here, in these ordinary rooms, that future lives were quietly prepared, one small action at a time, one gentle example after another. The emotional atmosphere of a home mattered as much as its physical structure. Women often carried the responsibility of creating calm and reassurance, especially in times of difficulty. A warm meal placed on the table, a child soothed to sleep, or a space kept clean despite challenges, these details gave families a sense of stability. In periods of economic struggle, when money was scarce and work uncertain, this emotional care was as vital as food or warmth. It reminded families that, even in hardship, there was a place of safety and belonging. Though often unnoticed, the presence of women's patience and strength was the unseen foundation that allowed households to endure. These quiet qualities gave depth to the home, making it more than walls and furniture, but a true center of life. Time in the home was not entirely consumed by labor. There were also moments of rest, reflection, and creativity. Women found small windows of quiet to embroider, to read if they could, or to spend time telling stories. These activities may have been brief, tucked between tasks, but they were deeply important. They restored energy, preserved cultural traditions, and gave space for imagination. Sometimes families gathered around the fire to listen to tales or to sing simple songs. These rituals connected them to the past and offered joy within routine. The balance between work and rest, though delicate, reminded families that life was more than survival. It was also about finding meaning in the little moments. Food preparation was one of the most significant tasks within the home. Meals were not quick or convenient, but required long effort. Bread had to be kneaded and baked, vegetables cleaned and boiled, stews left to simmer for hours. Women planned carefully, stretching supplies to last, making do with what was available, and ensuring that nothing went to waste. Preservation techniques like drying, salting, or storing root vegetables were common, especially in rural areas. In cities, women relied more on markets, bargaining for the best prices and freshest produce. Each meal reflected both skill and endurance. To feed a family day after day was not a small responsibility, was a task that required wisdom, patience, and an understanding of the household's needs. The true benefit of these meals came by the will of the Almighty, while women's care turned provision into sustenance. Cleaning, too, was a demanding part of life. Without modern machines or conveniences, washing clothes and keeping a home tidy meant hours of labor. Women scrubbed garments by hand, hauling water and working in cold conditions. Floors had to be swept daily, surfaces wiped, and bedding shaken out to keep households healthy. These chores were relentless, yet they created order out of chaos. Cleanliness gave families dignity, helped prevent illness, and created an environment where children could grow. The sight of freshly washed linens drying in the sun or a swept floor shining faintly in lamplight spoke of care and pride. Though exhausting, these efforts were visible expressions of women's devotion, reminders that love was often shown through actions rather than words. Furnishings within the home carried stories, passed down or carefully saved for. A sturdy cradle might have rocked several generations of infants. A wooden table may have been scarred with the marks of countless meals. Women often served as keepers of these objects, repairing them when needed, protecting them, and weaving them into family life. Even when possessions were few, they carried weight and memory. Every chest, chair, or blanket reflected not only utility, but continuity. Through care, women linked the past with the present, ensuring that children grew up surrounded by reminders of their roots. These items were not merely things, but vessels of memory, cherished because of the lives they touched and the moments they silently witnessed across time. In rural homes, Animals were often part of daily routines, and women cared for them alongside other duties. Chickens provided eggs, cows gave milk, and goats or sheep added to a household's resources. Tending to animals required steady commitment, feeding them, cleaning their spaces, and ensuring they remained healthy. These tasks were not glamorous, but they added nourishment and stability to families. The benefit of animals, too, came only by the permission of the Almighty, who allowed creation to provide. Women's role was to manage and care for these creatures with diligence. The presence of animals in or near homes created a sense of rhythm and connection to the natural world, another layer of responsibility woven into daily life. Even in cities, where livestock was less common, women often worked with markets to supply households with essentials. They carried baskets through crowded streets, selecting food, bargaining for better deals, and returning with ingredients to transform into meals. These errands were more than chores. They were small negotiations with the outside world, requiring skill and awareness. Knowing which vendors could be trusted, when to buy, and how to stretch coins the farthest was a form of wisdom. Women carried this responsibility quietly, shaping not only what their families ate, but also how resources were balanced across the week. These small choices had lasting impact, proving that running a home demanded both patience inside the house and sharpness outside it. As we step away from this glimpse into 19th century homes, one lesson stands out clearly. Life was sustained by the constant effort of women who made ordinary spaces into centers of care, strength, and meaning. Their work was quiet, often unseen, but without it, households would falter and families would suffer. Through patience, creativity, and endurance, women turned homes into sanctuaries, giving shelter not only from the weather outside, but also from the struggles of the world. If you have enjoyed this calm journey, you may gently subscribe so that you do not miss the next quiet story. In our upcoming tale, we will explore something different, yet just as fascinating. What did medieval knights do when they weren't fighting? A question that will carry us into another gentle corner of history, waiting quietly for us to discover together. Clothing in the 19th century was more than fabric stitched together. It was a statement of identity, of modesty, and of resilience in daily life. Women woke each morning and dressed with care, not only to face the tasks ahead, but also to maintain dignity and self-respect. In rural cottages, clothes were often handmade, passed from one generation to another, patched and repurposed as long as the fabric held. In cities, garments were purchased from markets or sewn by skilled hands in small rooms filled with thread and needles. Every piece of clothing told a story, reflecting the effort behind it. A dress might be plain and simple, yet the hours of work it took to create made it valuable beyond measure. Though styles shifted as decades passed, the principle remained constant. Clothing was part of life's rhythm, shaping how women moved through their world and how they were seen within their communities. Imagine the layers that formed a typical outfit. Women often wore long dresses, modestly covering their bodies from neck to ankle, with sleeves reaching the wrists. Beneath these, there were petticoats to give the dress structure, and sometimes aprons to protect the fabric from wear. Shawls were wrapped around shoulders for warmth, while bonnets or simple head coverings shielded hair from dust and sun. Each layer had a purpose, offering protection, modesty, or durability. While elaborate gowns existed for the wealthy, most women lived in practical garments designed for work and repetition. These outfits had to survive long days filled with labor cooking, cleaning, tending gardens, or walking through muddy streets. Even when worn thin, clothing carried a sense of respectability, showing that, despite hardship, women valued presentation. It was not about vanity, but about care and preservation. a quiet dignity woven into every stitch. Colors varied depending on materials and resources. Rural women often wore muted shades, earthy browns, faded blues, soft grays colors that came from dyes made locally, sometimes even from plants grown nearby. In cities, access to broader markets meant brighter fabrics could sometimes be found, though still limited by cost. Sunday or special clothing might be kept aside, worn only on occasions that demanded greater formality. For daily wear, however, practical shades were chosen, not easily stained by soil or smoke. This careful balance between usefulness and modest expression reflected women's awareness of their environments. Clothing did not define them, but it helped them move with confidence through both private spaces and public streets. The choice of fabric and color was always shaped by necessity, but within those boundaries, women still found ways to express small touches of beauty and individuality. The act of making clothes was itself an essential skill. Many women sewed for their households, working by lamplight or in daylight streaming through windows. Thread was precious, fabric even more so, and mistakes meant extra time spent unpicking stitches. Yet sewing was more than a chore, it was an art of endurance. Mothers taught daughters how to mend torn hems, how to patch elbows, how to adjust garments so they would last another season. In some households, women took in sewing for others, earning a little extra by stitching garments for neighbors or local shops. Their work was slow, careful, and demanding, but it held quiet pride. Every completed garment carried the story of diligence, every repaired seam a reminder of resilience. In a world where resources were scarce, the needle and thread were tools of survival, preserving clothing that might otherwise have been lost. Footwear was often humble. In villages, women might own only a single pair of shoes, worn until soles wore thin, then patched and repatched. Boots were valuable, especially in wet or snowy conditions, and families often saved to afford them. In warmer months, some went barefoot around home or fields to preserve shoes for when they were most needed. In cities, cobblers repaired footwear again and again, prolonging their use. The act of caring for shoes, cleaning them, drying them, patching leather, was another form of household labor. Though often overlooked, shoes made the difference between comfort and hardship, especially for women who spent hours walking or working on their feet. They were not symbols of luxury, but instruments of endurance, carrying women through markets, fields, and factories with quiet persistence. Head coverings were also significant. Bonnets, kerchiefs, and shawls shielded hair from dust, weather, and the sun's heat. In rural areas, women often tied simple cloths around their heads while working outdoors, practical and easy to wash. In cities, bonnets, shaped from straw or fabric, became more common, not only for protection but also as modest accessories. These coverings gave women a way to present themselves respectfully, to shield their hair, and to maintain a sense of order even in busy environments. They were not meant to display wealth or status, except in higher social circles, but for most women, they symbolized practicality and modesty combined. The daily act of tying a bonnet or wrapping a shawl was a small ritual, one that prepared women to step outside, to face neighbors, or to go about errands with a sense of readiness. Washing clothing was another demanding responsibility. Without modern detergents or machines, women scrubbed garments by hand, soaking them in basins or rivers, scrubbing with brushes or stones, and rinsing them with care. This work often left hands raw from cold water and soap. Clean clothes were hung outside to dry, filling yards or alleyways with flapping fabric. The sight of laundry drying in the wind was a common image in both rural and urban settings. Beyond cleanliness, it reflected order, an outward sign of a woman's effort to keep her household dignified. Fresh garments provided warmth, health, and comfort. Though the task was grueling, the results mattered deeply to families who relied on women's steady hands to maintain not only hygiene but also a sense of pride. These were quiet victories, woven into the rhythm of ordinary days. Special occasions called for different garments, carefully preserved and rarely worn. A woman might have a single finer dress, reserved for gatherings, for visits, or for moments of significance. These outfits were guarded closely, wrapped in cloth, or stored in chests to protect them from damage. Wearing such garments gave women a chance to feel lifted from the ordinary, to step briefly into a role of formality. These dresses were not extravagant, but they represented moments of joy, dignity, or remembrance. A simple ribbon tied differently, a clean bonnet pressed carefully, a shawl unfolded from storage. These details added meaning to occasions. Such clothing symbolized not status or vanity, but celebration and memory, woven into the flow of ordinary life. Even these modest touches reminded families of the significance of marking time, of honoring moments that mattered most. The weight of clothing also shaped daily movement. Layers made work more cumbersome, and fabric could be heavy, especially in wet weather. Yet women learned to move within these constraints, balancing chores with the garments that defined their era. Long skirts had to be lifted when walking through mud. Aprons protected fabric during tasks, and shawls were adjusted constantly for warmth or modesty. These small adjustments became second nature, part of the rhythm of each day. Though clothing restricted in some ways, it also provided protection, dignity, and endurance. Women adapted gracefully, turning necessity into routine, carrying themselves with patience despite the burdens their garments added to daily labor. At the end of each day, garments were often folded, hung, or prepared for the next morning. Women tended to their clothing carefully, brushing dirt away, stitching small tears, or laying out garments for the following dawn. These routines reflected foresight and care, ensuring that families remained ready for the tasks ahead. The cycle of dressing, working, mending, and preserving repeated endlessly, yet it created a sense of stability. Clothing was not only a practical necessity, but also a quiet expression of identity, of modest endurance, and of the resilience that defined women's lives in the 19th century. To look at their clothing is to see not just fabric, but a reflection of their patience, creativity, and steady role within the home and the wider community. Clothing in the 19th century also revealed the contrasts between rural and urban life. In small villages, garments were built for durability. Women often spun thread, wove fabric, and crafted clothing that lasted for years, even if it meant the same dress was worn daily, with patches added over time. In the cities, however, industrial textile production introduced cheaper fabrics, allowing some women to purchase ready-made clothing or sew from bolts of cloth bought in markets. These differences reflected not just geography, but also the changes sweeping across society. Yet whether made at home or purchased, garments carried the same role, providing protection, modesty, and respectability. The contrast between rustic simplicity and urban variety highlighted how deeply clothing was tied to circumstance, yet it also showed a shared commitment among women to care for their families through the garments they provided and maintained. The influence of social class was also evident in clothing. Wealthier women wore dresses made from finer fabrics such as silk or imported cotton, often decorated with lace or ribbons. They could afford more variety, having separate garments for morning, afternoon, and evening wear. Yet even here, modesty remained central. with dresses long and layered, and accessories carefully chosen to enhance dignity rather than expose. For working-class women, clothing was practical and limited, sometimes consisting of just a few dresses, rotated across the week. Still, even with fewer resources, women valued neatness and presentation. A well-patched dress, kept clean and pressed, was a sign of care and respect for oneself and one's household. Across class lines, clothing reflected more than wealth. It reflected the effort, patience, and thoughtfulness of the women who wore and maintained it. The tools of sewing themselves were precious. Needles, thread, scissors, and thimbles were kept carefully, often stored in small boxes or pouches. A single needle could serve for months, even years, if preserved well. Thread was wound onto wooden spools or cards, ready for countless evenings of repair. These tools, though small, carried immense importance. With them, garments could be extended far beyond their original life. Women passed these tools from one generation to the next, along with the knowledge of how to use them. Sewing kits were not luxuries, they were lifelines, ensuring that clothing could withstand the demands of labor and weather. In every home, whether rural or urban, these tools symbolized a woman's ability to provide endurance and order, quietly sustaining her family through skill and persistence. Seasonal adjustments shaped wardrobes as well. In winter, heavy wool garments, shawls, and cloaks became necessary, layered to keep warmth in against bitter winds. Gloves, if available, were carefully stored and reused each year, often repaired many times over. In summer, lighter fabrics like cotton allowed for comfort, though dresses still remained long and modest. The cycle of seasons required foresight. Clothes had to be cleaned, packed away, and guarded from moths or damage during months they were not in use. Preparing a household's clothing for changing weather was as important as storing food or fuel. Women carried this responsibility with care, ensuring that their families faced the elements with as much comfort as circumstances allowed, trusting that protection ultimately came from the Almighty, while their steady work served as preparation. Textiles themselves were a world of meaning. Homespun linen carried the touch of hours spent at the loom, while factory-made cotton hinted at the growing industrial age. Flannel, muslin, and wool each held different textures and purposes. Women understood these materials deeply, knowing which to use for undergarments, which for outerwear, and which could withstand daily work. Fabric was not only functional but symbolic of the changes of the century. Rural households still clung to traditional weaving, while urban markets displayed bolts of machine-woven cloth. Yet, in both places, women adapted, selecting materials that balanced durability, modesty, and affordability. To handle fabric was to handle possibility, turning flat cloth into garments that would shape daily lives for years to come. Washing and maintaining these textiles was a constant cycle. White linen needed to be scrubbed to keep its brightness. Wool required careful drying to avoid shrinking, and cotton, though easier, still demanded attention. Women became skilled at understanding the nature of each fabric, how to treat it so that it lasted longer. Knowledge of soap making, stain removal, and drying techniques was passed down like hidden wisdom. In cities, laundries began to appear, where women worked long hours washing for others, yet at home, the same effort continued quietly. Laundry days were exhausting, yet essential, and every clean garment hung in the breeze was a sign of order, persistence, and dignity. Through these routines, families carried on with fresh clothing, thanks to the unending patience of women who gave time and strength to this cycle. Accessories also played a role in daily dress, though not as luxuries for most. A shawl added warmth, a belt helped secure garments, and small pins or brooches fastened layers together. In wealthier households, jewelry might exist, but for most families, accessories were simple and functional. A ribbon tied neatly, a bonnet trimmed with modest decoration, or a carefully chosen piece of fabric could elevate an outfit, bringing a touch of individuality. These small details gave women an outlet for expression, even within the limits of modesty and necessity. They were not about excess, but about care-proof, that within the repetition of daily life, there was still room for beauty, even in the smallest touches of cloth and color. The process of repairing clothes was constant. Tears in fabric, holes at elbows, and frayed hems were all carefully addressed. Women sat quietly in the evenings, needle in hand, patching with patience. Old clothes were often repurposed, turned into smaller garments for children, or into rags for household use. Nothing was discarded lightly. Each piece of fabric carried value, and women knew how to extend its life until every last thread was useful. This process was not only about thrift, but about responsibility. It reflected an understanding that resources were limited and that care was essential. Through every patch and seam, women demonstrated a resilience that allowed families to endure through seasons of scarcity and hardship. Clothing also carried social meaning. When neighbors saw each other in markets or at gatherings, their garments reflected not just personal effort, but family reputation. A woman dressed neatly, even in simple clothing, showed respect for herself and her household. Appearance became a silent language, communicating values of modesty, discipline, and care. Though society placed heavy expectations on women, many carried them with quiet strength, turning clothing into a tool of dignity rather than pride. The respect earned through presentation was not about luxury, but about endurance and self-control, values that held weight within communities. In this way, clothing was not just fabric, it was part of the moral and social fabric that bound people together. As we leave this reflection on clothing, we see more than dresses and garments. We see the steady rhythm of sewing by lamplight, the care taken in folding garments at night, the quiet pride in presenting oneself with dignity. Clothing in the 19th century was not about extravagancy, was about survival, modesty, and the enduring labor of women who gave life meaning through the smallest stitches. Each garment carried their patience, each repair their resilience, each outfit their quiet devotion. Through their work, clothing became more than necessity, became a reflection of identity, endurance, and care, a fabric not just worn, but lived. Education in the 19th century was a story of gradual change. At the beginning of the century, opportunities for learning were limited, especially for girls in small villages or poor families. Many households valued work over study because survival often depended on every pair of hands. Yet, quietly, literacy began to spread. Families who could read sometimes taught daughters at home, passing along not only letters and words, but the ability to reflect, to record, and to imagine. For women, the act of reading was not only a skill, but a doorway to new worlds. A simple book, a handwritten prayer, or even a household ledger became tools for education. These early steps may seem small, but they built the foundation for greater opportunities that slowly emerged as the century unfolded. Education was not universal, but it was growing, reshaping lives one lesson at a time. In rural communities, learning often happened within the walls of the home. Mothers, fathers, or older siblings passed along the alphabet, taught children how to count, or helped them recite passages from well-worn books. The home became a classroom, its lessons woven into daily routines. Reading might happen by the fire at night, or while helping with simple tasks during the day. For many girls, this was their only education, shaped by the patience of family members rather than formal teachers. Yet, even limited exposure to reading and writing made a difference. It gave women tools to manage households more effectively, to keep records, to pass down knowledge. Though their education was often informal, it created lasting impact, quietly preparing minds for a wider world beyond the household walls. Small schools began to appear more frequently as the century progressed. In villages, a single room might gather dozens of children of different ages, all learning together. Teachers used chalk and slate, with lessons often focused on reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. Girls sat alongside boys, though sometimes their attendance was interrupted by household duties. In towns, schools were more organized, with stricter schedules and standardized lessons. For many children, this was their first structured environment outside the home, introducing them to discipline, responsibility, and cooperation. Women who managed to attend these schools carried their knowledge into adulthood, applying it to both domestic responsibilities and, for some, modest professional opportunities like teaching or sewing. Each small classroom represented progress, even if uneven, offering glimpses of a future where education would become more accessible to all. Books were treasures in the 19th century, not as easily available as they are today. Families who owned them valued them deeply, passing them down like heirlooms. Children often learned to read from religious texts or practical manuals, their pages worn soft from frequent handling. Some women kept journals, carefully writing in the quiet of evenings. Others found comfort in borrowing books, sharing them within communities, or listening as someone read aloud. For those who could not read, storytelling carried lessons forward, weaving memory into culture. Whether written or spoken, words became bridges between generations. For women, the ability to engage with books was both a privilege and a responsibility, offering knowledge that enriched their households and strengthened their communities. The act of writing held particular significance. A girl who learned to write could keep accounts for her family, record recipes, or maintain correspondence with relatives. Writing was not only practical, but also a way of preserving memory. Letters carried affection across distances, linking families in towns and villages with those who had moved to cities or abroad. A journal allowed a woman to reflect quietly on her days, storing thoughts she may never speak aloud. Each word written represented patience, skill, and reflection. Though few women had the chance to write extensively, those who did left behind valuable glimpses of their inner lives. Through their careful penmanship, the quiet voices of the 19th century still reach us, speaking softly across time. Education was shaped by class as much as by geography. Wealthier families could afford tutors or private schools, where girls studied literature, music, languages, and art alongside practical subjects. Middle-class families valued literacy for managing business or households. For poorer families, however, survival took priority, and schooling often came second. Still, even among those with limited means, the desire to learn persisted. A scrap of paper, a borrowed book, or an evening lesson offered by a neighbor carried deep importance. These small efforts reflected a belief that education, even in modest forms, was worth pursuing. Though unevenly distributed, learning was spreading, creating ripples that would shape future generations. Religious communities also played a large role in education. Many schools were established by churches or faith-based groups, teaching not only literacy but also moral guidance. Lessons often began with reading sacred texts, connecting education with reflection. For many women, this was their first encounter with formal schooling. While resources were limited, these schools provided structure and consistency, instilling values alongside practical skills. They emphasized patience, obedience, and discipline, qualities that shaped students' lives beyond the classroom. Though these schools varied in quality, they marked a step toward broader access, reminding families that learning could be a communal effort, tied not only to knowledge, but to shared values that guided daily life. The limitations of education in this era should also be remembered. Not all girls were permitted to study, and not all families could afford to let children spend time away from work. Illness, distance, and poverty often interrupted schooling, leaving many women with partial or incomplete education. Yet the very existence of these obstacles highlighted the determination of those who pursued learning anyway. A girl reading by candlelight after finishing chores, or a woman practicing letters on scraps of paper, reflected a quiet persistence. Education may not have been guaranteed, but the effort to seek it was powerful, a sign of resilience that mirrored the endurance women displayed in every part of their lives. Beyond formal lessons, women gained education through observation and participation in daily tasks. Managing a household required skills in planning, budgeting, and problem-solving. All forms of practical education that developed through experience. Cooking, sewing, and tending gardens were not simply chores but structured forms of learning, preparing women to handle responsibility. In this sense, education extended far beyond books or classrooms. It lived in the rhythm of life itself, in the lessons passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. Knowledge was not always written down, but it was carried forward, preserved in the skills that sustained families and communities. By mid-century, discussions about broader access to education were becoming more common. Social reformers argued that literacy strengthened not only individuals, but entire societies. Governments began to support schooling more directly, though progress remained slow and uneven. For women, these conversations opened small but meaningful possibilities. A growing number of schools admitted girls, and slowly, the idea that women could learn alongside men gained ground. Still, for most women in the 19th century, education remained modest, focused on essentials, shaped by circumstance, and limited by resources. Yet even within these boundaries, women found ways to learn, to teach, and to preserve knowledge. Their efforts carried quiet power, laying the groundwork for the greater educational opportunities that would arrive in future generations. By the later decades of the century, new institutions for women's education began to appear, especially in larger towns and cities. Some schools trained women to become teachers, a profession seen as appropriate and honorable. Others introduced subjects like history, geography, and science, though often in simplified form. These opportunities, though still limited, represented a gradual recognition that women could contribute intellectually as well as within households. For families who supported these paths, sending a daughter to school was both an investment and a risk, since her labor at home was missed. Yet the long-term benefits became visible as more women gained confidence in reading, writing, and critical thinking, quietly expanding their horizons beyond traditional roles. Even for those without access to formal education, the rise of printed material created new opportunities. Newspapers, pamphlets, and affordable books reached broader audiences, bringing knowledge into homes. Women who could read often shared aloud with neighbors or family members, spreading information through conversation. Literacy was no longer confined to the wealthy. It became a shared resource within communities. Reading aloud created a sense of connection, uniting households around stories, news, or lessons. In this way, even those who could not read directly were still touched by the expanding world of print. The power of words traveled through ears as well as eyes, showing how education flowed not only through institutions but through daily life. The influence of women as educators within their families cannot be overstated. Mothers who could read passed that gift to children, creating ripples that extended into the next generation. Teaching letters at the kitchen table, guiding little hands to form words, or reciting passages together became daily rituals. These acts carried no formal recognition, but they left lasting impact. Many children who later thrived in schools or professions began their journey in the quiet lessons of home. Women, through patience and persistence, became the first and most enduring teachers. Their classrooms were small, often just a corner by the fire, yet their influence shaped character, knowledge, and discipline in ways that reached far beyond the walls of the household. At the same time, not all women welcomed formal education. For some, tradition and necessity outweighed the value of reading and writing. Families struggling for survival sometimes viewed schooling as a distraction from essential labor. Others feared that too much education might unsettle established roles. These hesitations remind us that history was not a simple march of progress, but a complex balancing of needs and values. Yet, even within these doubts, women's roles as caregivers and moral guides ensured that some form of teaching always continued, whether through stories, songs, or practical instruction. Education found its way into every home, in ways both visible and invisible. It is also worth noting the emotional meaning of learning. For many women, literacy brought a sense of independence, a quiet confidence that came from being able to read a letter, sign a document, or understand written instructions. Writing gave them a private space, a way to reflect and preserve memory. These abilities, though simple by today's standards, were transformative in their time. They provided not only practical advantage, but also dignity, reminding women that their minds mattered, that their voices could endure on the page, even if society often overlooked them. Education became a form of resilience, a way to strengthen identity within the quiet routines of daily life. Some women used their literacy to contribute directly to their communities. Teachers in small schools shaped the next generation, while others organized reading groups or helped neighbors write letters. In cities, women sometimes worked as clerks or assistants, applying their skills to practical roles outside the home. These opportunities, though still modest, hinted at broader changes to come. By sharing knowledge, women extended the benefits of education beyond their households, weaving themselves into the social fabric in new ways. They became not only learners but also transmitters of culture, carrying forward traditions while introducing fresh ideas. Their influence grew quietly but steadily, grounded in the patient labor of teaching and guiding. Education also intersected with other forms of work. Seamstresses who could read patterns or instructions had an advantage. Shopkeepers' wives who managed accounts relied on literacy to keep businesses stable. Farmers' daughters who could calculate measures of grain or produce helped households plan effectively. These examples remind us that learning was not abstract, it had immediate, practical impact. Literacy and numeracy gave women tools to navigate economic life with greater confidence. While still bound by social expectations, their education became a subtle form of empowerment, woven into the ordinary acts of work and responsibility. Despite these gains, challenges persisted throughout the century. Many women remained excluded from formal opportunities, and inequalities between classes, regions, and nations remained strong. Progress was uneven, and for every step forward, there were still barriers. Yet the story of education in the 19th century is not defined by limitation, but by persistence. Women sought knowledge, wherever they could find it, carrying books, stories, and lessons across generations. Their efforts remind us that learning is not always grand or official. It often grows quietly, nurtured by patience and determination, taking root in ordinary lives. By the closing years of the century, the landscape of education had shifted. More schools admitted girls, literacy rates rose, and public discussion about women's education became louder. Though still far from equal, opportunities expanded enough to suggest new possibilities for the future. The sight of girls carrying books to school, of women teaching in classrooms, or of mothers reading by lamplight spoke of a changing world. These images captured the hope that education could bring stability, dignity, and growth, not only to individuals but to societies as a whole. As we step back from this glimpse of education in the 19th century, we see that it was not defined by grand achievements, but by quiet persistence. Each lesson taught at home, each page read by candlelight, each word carefully written in a letter contributed to a larger story of resilience. Women carried the gift of learning forward, often with little recognition, yet with lasting impact. Their pursuit of education was not only for themselves, but for their families, their communities, and the generations that followed. In their patience, in their determination, they built the foundation for broader opportunities to come, reminding us that history often turns, not on loud events, but on the quiet strength of ordinary lives. Work in the 19th century was rarely light, and for women, it was constant. Their labor began with the rising of the sun and often continued until the last embers of the fire faded at night. While history often remembers soldiers, politicians, or industrial magnates, the daily work of women provided the true foundation of life. Their duties stretched beyond the home, into fields, workshops, and marketplaces. Rural women rose early to tend crops and animals alongside household tasks, their hands calloused from tools and work. In towns and cities, women stitched in dimly lit rooms, carried laundry to wash houses, or sold goods in crowded markets. This labor was not celebrated, but it was essential. Without it, families could not endure. Their livelihoods, though modest, were bound tightly to survival, a steady stream of effort that sustained households day after day. In rural settings, women often worked side by side with men in the fields, harvesting grain, gathering vegetables, or tending to livestock were daily necessities. These tasks were physically demanding, requiring strength, endurance, and constant attention. Women carried baskets heavy with produce, milked cows at dawn, and spun wool by hand to be woven into fabric. Their work was not separate from the household, it was the household. The garden, the field, the kitchen, and the barn were all interconnected spaces, woven together by their labor. Even young girls joined in, learning early how to plant, hoe, and carry. This rhythm of work defined life in villages, tying families to the land and to the seasons, their survival dependent on both human effort and the provision of the Almighty who allowed the earth to give sustenance. Seasonal work shaped the pace of rural women's lives. Spring brought planting, summer brought long days of tending crops, autumn meant harvest, and winter focused on preservation and repair. Each season required different forms of labor, all of them vital. Women dried herbs, salted meats, and stored root vegetables to ensure food lasted through colder months. They spun wool into yarn, wove cloth, and prepared garments to withstand harsh weather. These seasonal cycles were demanding, yet they carried a certain rhythm. The predictability of tasks gave structure to life, a sense of purpose repeated year after year. Even as circumstances changed, the earth's turning remained constant, and women's work adapted to its flow. Their hands turned the seasons into survival, blending tradition with resilience in every motion. In towns, women's livelihoods often centered around trades and services. Seamstresses filled workshops, sewing garments for neighbors or shops. The sound of needles piercing fabric, the creak of wooden chairs, and the dim light of candles defined their workspace. Some women took in mending from households, repairing garments so they could last longer. Others worked as laundresses, hauling water, scrubbing clothes on washboards, and wringing them out with aching hands. It was exhausting work, often done in damp conditions that took a toll on health. Yet it was steady income, a way to add to family survival. These urban trades, though small in scale, reflected women's ingenuity and endurance, transforming modest skills into livelihoods that carried entire households forward. Markets were also part of women's work. In villages, women sold eggs, butter, vegetables, or woven goods, trading surplus for items they could not produce themselves. In cities, stalls were filled with fabrics, baked bread, or small household items crafted by women's hands. Standing in these bustling spaces, women became negotiators as well as providers, balancing fairness with the need to earn. The market was noisy, crowded, and unpredictable, yet within it, women carved out roles of significance. Their contributions were not measured in large profits but in steady exchanges that kept households supplied. Each coin earned meant a candle for light, flour for bread, or fuel for warmth. Markets were places where women's quiet economic strength became visible, woven into the fabric of community life. Teaching was one of the few professions open to women, particularly as the century progressed. Schools, especially in towns, often employed women as teachers for younger children. Their work required patience, long hours, and modest pay. Yet teaching carried respect, and it provided women with a rare role beyond the household. In one-room schoolhouses, they guided lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic, shaping minds while balancing discipline with care. For many women, this profession was both a livelihood and a calling, a way to contribute to society while sustaining themselves. Though challenges were constant limited resources, overcrowded classrooms, the influence of female teachers stretched far, planting seeds of knowledge in the lives of countless children. Some women worked as domestic servants in wealthier households. They cooked meals, cleaned rooms, washed clothes, and cared for children not their own. The work was exhausting and often left them with little personal freedom, yet it provided food, shelter, and wages. Servants formed the unseen backbone of large households, their labor enabling the comfort of others. Life as a servant was not easy, and many endured long hours with little recognition. Still, within these roles, women displayed resilience, carrying dignity even in difficult circumstances. Their efforts ensured that households ran smoothly, their invisible labor shaping the lives of those they served. Industrialization introduced new forms of work, particularly in textile factories. Rows of machines filled with thread and cloth created opportunities for women to earn wages, but at great cost. Hours were long, conditions harsh, and pay modest. The clatter of machines echoed through vast halls, where women stood or sat for endless shifts. Despite the strain, factory work offered something new: regular wages paid directly to women. This income, though small, represented independence in ways unseen before. Factories also revealed the harsh realities of industrial progress, where women's health and safety were often overlooked. Still, their presence in these workplaces marked a turning point, showing how women adapted even to the challenges of mechanized labor. Home-based industries continued alongside factories. Women produced lace, spun thread, or crafted small goods within their homes, selling them to merchants or directly in markets. These tasks allowed them to balance household responsibilities with income generation. It was work squeezed between other duties, sewing after children slept, weaving in early mornings, or mending by candlelight. Though often poorly paid, this labor carried importance. It provided coins for essentials and kept skills alive. Home industries reflected women's adaptability, their ability to turn small resources into livelihood, sustaining families quietly but powerfully. Every stitch, every piece of lace, every woven thread became part of the hidden economy of the century. Even caring for others was considered part of women's livelihoods. Midwives, healers, or caretakers provided essential services to their communities. Though not always recognized formally, their knowledge was trusted, passed down through experience and observation. Women tended to the sick, comforted mothers in childbirth, and offered remedies made from herbs or simple treatments. These roles were deeply respected within local circles, even if not written into official history. Their work was not only about survival, but about compassion, offering comfort in times of fear or pain. In their care, women reminded communities of the value of presence and patience, qualities that defined the essence of livelihood itself. For many women, balancing work inside and outside the home required constant effort. A woman might spend her morning preparing meals, cleaning, and tending children, only to turn in the afternoon to sewing for others or selling goods at the market. The lines between domestic responsibility and economic activity blurred, leaving little time for rest. Yet this balance was managed with remarkable endurance. Women became skilled at weaving together tasks, shifting roles seamlessly throughout the day. This flexibility ensured that households continued to function even under financial strain. Their work was not only physical but also mental, requiring planning, organization, and awareness of needs, both immediate and long-term. It was a delicate rhythm, held together by persistence and devotion. Widows often faced the greatest challenges, carrying entire households on their shoulders. Without a partner's income or assistance, they relied heavily on their own labor and the support of extended families or communities. Some took in washing, others sold handmade goods, and some worked in service roles. Their resilience was tested constantly, yet many managed to sustain families through sheer determination. The difficulties they endured reflected both the fragility and the strength of women's positions in society. While vulnerable, they also displayed resourcefulness, finding ways to navigate life's obstacles. Their stories, though rarely told in history books, illustrate the unspoken courage that kept countless households alive. Migration also shaped women's work. Some moved from villages to cities in search of employment, often becoming domestic workers or factory hands. Others traveled further, crossing borders or oceans with families, seeking better lives abroad. These journeys were rarely easy, demanding adaptation to new environments, languages, and cultures. Women's skills often provided the foundation for settling in unfamiliar places, managing homes, cooking with new ingredients, or finding work in textiles or service. Their adaptability was extraordinary, transforming uncertainty into survival. In every new setting, they carried fragments of their old lives while building new ones, stitching together continuity even amid change. Migration revealed both hardship and possibility, with women at its center. Another form of work, often overlooked, was emotional labor. Women carried the responsibility of maintaining peace within households, resolving disputes, comforting children, and providing encouragement during difficult times. While not measured in wages, this labor held immense value. Families relied on women's patience and steadiness to navigate challenges. A gentle word, a calm presence, or a reminder of hope could mean the difference between despair and resilience. This invisible work shaped not only households, but also communities, binding people together through care. It was as real as harvesting fields or sewing garments, though less visible. In many ways, it was the glue that held daily life together, sustaining spirits as much as bodies. Some women became involved in small-scale business ventures. They sold baked goods, brewed tea for travelers, or managed small shops alongside their husbands. In towns, women sometimes ran inns or boarding houses, welcoming travelers and maintaining order within busy spaces. These ventures demanded sharp management skills, balancing costs, customers, and supplies. Success was never guaranteed, but many women thrived in these roles, using ingenuity to create livelihoods within limited opportunities. Their ability to manage resources and people reflected a quiet business sense, one that carried households through uncertain times. Though rarely recognized as entrepreneurs, they were indeed small-scale managers of economies, proving that women's contributions extended beyond home and field. Child labor was also part of this world, and women bore the weight of guiding children who worked. In factories and fields, children were often employed, sometimes from a very young age. Mothers balanced the need for income with the responsibility of protecting their children as best they could. Some taught skills that could make work safer. Others sought ways to supplement income so children could return to school. This balancing act reflected the constant tension between survival and care. Women's vigilance shaped how families endured harsh labor systems, ensuring that, despite difficulties, children carried forward lessons of resilience and compassion. It was another unseen form of protection, one that softened the edges of hardship where possible. Women's livelihoods also included healthcare in informal forms. Midwives, caregivers, and women with herbal knowledge became trusted figures in their communities. Their experience in childbirth, illness, or simple remedies provided stability where doctors were scarce or too expensive. They blended practical wisdom with patience, offering comfort when little else was available. Communities often turned to them first, valuing their accessibility and familiarity. Their labor may not have been recognized by institutions, but it was essential. Every life saved, every illness eased, carried the weight of their quiet service. In this way, women's work extended into the realm of health, preserving not just survival, but also dignity within their communities. For many, wages were low, hours long, and recognition absent. Yet despite these conditions, women continued to labor with persistence. Their contributions built the hidden framework of society, a foundation upon which others depended. While history often overlooked their presence, their work was everywhere, woven into fields, stitched into garments, echoed in classrooms, and preserved in markets. Their resilience ensured continuity in times of change, proving that survival was not built on grand events alone, but on the quiet strength of countless women who bore daily burdens with endurance. Their work, though undervalued, shaped the very structure of 19th century life. By the close of the century, whispers of reform began to circulate. Voices rose to recognize the hardships women endured, calling for fairer wages, better conditions, and greater respect for their contributions. Though change was slow, the acknowledgement itself marked a shift. Women's labor could no longer be dismissed as invisible. Their roles in factories, households, and communities revealed a force too vital to ignore. The seeds of these conversations would bear fruit in later generations, reshaping how work was understood and valued. But in the 19th century itself, the focus remained on endurance, on the tireless rhythm of tasks, the resilience that never ceased. and the quiet determination that defined women's livelihoods. As we reflect on women's work in this century, we see more than endless labor. We see resilience stitched into every garment, perseverance in every harvest, patience in every classroom. Their livelihoods were not glamorous, but they were indispensable. Women shaped not only their family's survival, but also the stability of communities and societies. Their labor was the steady heartbeat beneath the louder events of history. To recognize their work is to honor the unseen effort that allowed the world to move forward, one day at a time, one task at a time, sustained by the endurance of ordinary women who carried extraordinary weight in the quiet flow of daily life. In the 19th century, women's lives were shaped as much by expectations as by necessity. Society carried strong ideas about what women should and should not do. In many cultures, women were seen primarily as caretakers, guardians of family honor, and keepers of the household. This was not written in strict laws everywhere, but it was deeply rooted in tradition and daily life. From a young age, girls were often guided toward modesty, patience, and service to others. These values shaped how communities measured respectability, creating invisible rules that guided behavior. While men often worked in public spaces, women were expected to maintain the private ones, ensuring that homes reflected order and morality. These expectations were not always fair or easy, yet they defined much of women's place within the century's social structure. The idea of the ideal woman varied depending on class and location, but certain patterns appeared everywhere. Women were expected to be modest in dress, gentle in speech, and diligent in work. They were seen as moral anchors within families, shaping children's character and supporting husbands' reputations. These expectations could be heavy, yet they gave women influence in subtle ways. A woman's conduct was often thought to reflect the dignity of her entire household. Neighbors and communities paid attention to how she carried herself, how her children behaved, and how her home appeared. Though these standards were demanding, women navigated them with quiet strength, finding ways to uphold values while balancing the reality of daily challenges. Marriage was often considered the central path for women, a role shaped by tradition and community expectation. A woman who married was seen as fulfilling her duty, creating a household where she could raise children and support her partner. For those who did not marry, life could be more difficult, since society sometimes viewed them with suspicion or pity. Yet not all women saw marriage as their only purpose. Some found dignity in work, in education, or in community service. Still, the weight of social expectation pressed heavily, reminding them that their value was often judged by their family role. This tension shaped many women's lives, balancing personal resilience with communal pressure. Motherhood, too, was surrounded by expectation. Women were seen as nurturers, tasked not only with raising children, but also with instilling values, guiding behavior, and maintaining moral order. Mothers carried responsibility for shaping the next generation, teaching them patience, modesty, and endurance. This role was honored in some ways, but it was also demanding, leaving little room for rest. Society rarely recognized the toll of constant caregiving, yet it praised the outcomes: a well-raised child, a disciplined household. For many women, this responsibility was both a source of pride and a heavy burden, carried with quiet determination. Their influence was not public, but it was foundational, echoing through generations. Social gatherings often reinforced these expectations. Women were judged not only on their own behavior, but also on the impression they gave as part of families. Hosting neighbors, attending religious gatherings, or participating in community events meant constant awareness of presentation. A woman who managed her home well, appeared modestly dressed, and spoke with kindness was admired. These events were not simply moments of leisure, they were silent examinations of how well women upheld social ideals. Yet within these gatherings, women also found solidarity, sharing stories and offering each other quiet support. Beneath the weight of expectation, networks of care existed, reminding them that they were not alone in navigating societal pressures. Religion often reinforced women's expected roles. Women were encouraged to be devoted, patient, and supportive, upholding moral values within the family. Faith gave them guidance, but also boundaries, shaping how they were perceived and what was considered acceptable. At the same time, religious spaces sometimes offered women rare opportunities for leadership within small groups, teaching younger members or organizing community aid. These roles reflected both expectation and empowerment, intertwining tradition with subtle forms of influence. The balance was delicate, but it allowed women to contribute meaningfully, even within defined boundaries. Their presence in these spaces gave communities stability, showing how expectations, though restrictive, could also open pathways for service. The weight of reputation hung heavily on women's shoulders. Gossip and community judgment could affect entire families, making modest behavior essential. A woman's speech, dress, and actions were constantly observed, often more closely than men's. This vigilance created pressure but also encouraged caution, teaching women to navigate carefully within their environments. In some cases, it meant suppressing personal desires to maintain communal harmony. Yet many women turned this into a form of resilience, finding dignity in restraint and strength in discretion. They became guardians not only of households but of social trust, embodying the invisible rules that kept communities bound together. Education, when available, also reflected social expectations. For many, it was not intended to prepare women for professions, but to make them better wives, mothers, and homemakers. Lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic were often accompanied by instruction in sewing, cooking, and moral conduct. Knowledge was considered valuable, but only insofar as it contributed to household stability. Women who pursued broader learning sometimes faced criticism, as if stepping beyond acceptable roles. Still, even within these limits, education expanded horizons, planting seeds of thought that would grow in later generations. Social expectations may have tried to confine learning, but women found ways to carry it further, often quietly, within the spaces of daily life. Women's voices in public matters were often muted by expectation. They rarely spoke in community decisions, and their influence was usually indirect, shaped through family and private conversation. Yet this did not mean women lacked impact. Their guidance within households, their management of resources, and their moral influence shaped communities in subtle but powerful ways. The expectation that they remain silent in public only heightened the importance of their private voices. Through careful words and steady example, women carried influence that reached beyond the boundaries set for them. Though society rarely acknowledged it, their role was indispensable to the fabric of daily life. At times, expectations conflicted with reality. Poverty, illness, or loss often forced women to step outside traditional roles, working in ways society might not fully approve. In these moments, expectations bent, revealing the tension between ideals and necessities. Yet even when breaking from tradition, women were judged against the same standards. This constant balance between survival and social approval defined much of their existence. To live in the 19th century as a woman was to walk a narrow path, bordered by tradition on one side and reality on the other. Their endurance in maintaining dignity within this space reflected a strength that deserves recognition, even if history often overlooked it. Social expectations also shaped how women interacted across generations. Older women were often seen as guardians of tradition, responsible for passing down knowledge and values to younger ones. Mothers and grandmothers taught skills such as sewing, cooking, and household management, but they also offered guidance on behavior, modesty, and patience. These teachings were rarely formal. They came through example, repeated in daily life. Young girls absorbed these lessons quietly, watching and imitating until they became second nature. This passing down of values created continuity, ensuring that communities held together across time. Expectations might have been burdensome, but they also preserved cultural identity, making women central to the rhythm of tradition. Friendship among women offered relief from these pressures. In private, away from the watchful eyes of neighbors, women shared stories, laughed, and supported each other. These friendships provided space to be honest, to express frustrations, and to find comfort in shared experience. While society measured women against ideals, these private bonds reminded them of their humanity beyond expectation. Conversations whispered over sewing, laughter shared at markets, or comfort given in difficult times built a network of trust. These bonds were invisible to outsiders, but they carried immense strength. They showed that beneath layers of duty and expectation, women created their own spaces of freedom and connection. Work often tested the balance between expectation and reality. While women were expected to devote themselves to households, many also contributed economically. Factory labor, market trade, or domestic service all demanded their presence outside the home. Society sometimes criticized this, as though it conflicted with ideals of modesty and privacy. Yet survival left little choice. Women carried the double weight of expectation and necessity, working tirelessly while still striving to maintain social respectability. This tension highlighted the gap between ideals and lived reality, a gap women navigated with quiet resilience. Their ability to move between these worlds, public work and private duty, showed their adaptability. Even within constraint, the image of respectability was reinforced by the media of the time. Magazines, pamphlets, and moral guides often described the qualities of a proper woman. They emphasized modest dress, obedience, diligence, and careful speech. These publications reflected, and sometimes exaggerated, society's ideals. Yet, for many women, they also provided models to aspire to, even if those models were difficult to achieve. The written word became another layer of expectation, reminding women of their supposed roles and responsibilities. Still, not all accepted these portrayals unquestioningly. Some women quietly resisted, living in ways that did not align perfectly with the printed image. Their quiet defiance, though often invisible, hinted at the complexities beneath society's surface. Community judgment could be both a safeguard and a burden. On one hand, it encouraged shared values, creating a sense of cohesion. On the other, it could be harsh, leaving little room for individuality. A woman whose dress appeared untidy, whose children misbehaved, or whose household faltered, could face whispers and criticism. Reputation was fragile, built slowly and lost quickly. Women often felt the need to manage appearances carefully, balancing reality with expectation. This constant awareness shaped behavior, sometimes suppressing personal desires for the sake of communal harmony. While it preserved order, it also limited freedom, reminding women that their lives were never fully private. At the same time, expectation provided women with influence in subtle ways. By being seen as guardians of morality, they carried authority within households, shaping how children grew and how families interacted with neighbors. While society often silenced them in public matters, their private influence was undeniable. Through patience, example, and quiet discipline, women guided decisions, maintained harmony, and influenced the character of future generations. This influence, though indirect, was profound. It demonstrated that even within restrictive frameworks, women found ways to assert their presence, to shape lives, and to preserve dignity. For unmarried women, expectations created different challenges. Some were seen as burdens on families, others as outsiders within communities. Yet many single women carved meaningful roles for themselves, working, teaching, or caring for relatives. Their lives showed that value was not solely tied to marriage, even if society often insisted otherwise. These women revealed the breadth of possibility within constraint, shaping households and communities through effort and presence rather than through traditional family roles. Their resilience illustrated that dignity could be maintained in many forms, even in the face of narrow expectations. Children also absorbed these expectations from an early age. Girls were taught modesty, patience, and skill in household tasks, while boys were encouraged toward responsibility in work outside the home. These lessons reinforced social roles, preparing children to step into the patterns of their parents. Yet children also noticed the contradictions: how women worked tirelessly, how survival often demanded more than ideals allowed. This awareness planted questions that would grow in later generations, leading to shifts in how society viewed gender and responsibility. The seeds of change were sown in these quiet observations, carried silently in young minds. Despite the weight of expectation, women found pride in fulfilling their roles. To keep a home orderly, to raise children with care, and to carry themselves with dignity gave them a sense of accomplishment. Society may have placed boundaries around them, but within those boundaries, they cultivated resilience, patience, and endurance. Their fulfillment did not come from recognition or wealth, but from the knowledge that they upheld values cherished by their communities. This pride was not loud but steady, a quiet confidence rooted in service and devotion. It gave women strength to continue, even when expectations felt heavy. As we reflect on social expectations in the 19th century, we see both burden and resilience. Women were measured by standards, often unrealistic, yet they navigated them with dignity. They upheld households, nurtured communities, and shaped generations, all while walking a narrow path between tradition and necessity. Their strength lay not in freedom from expectation, but in their ability to carry it with grace, to adapt within its boundaries, and to leave a legacy that endured quietly yet powerfully. In their patience and resilience, we find a reminder that history is not only written in public triumphs, but also in the silent endurance of those who lived by society's invisible rules. Community was at the heart of 19th century life, and for women, it provided both support and connection. Though households often demanded most of their energy, women rarely lived in isolation. Neighbors, relatives, and friends formed networks of mutual aid, where kindness was exchanged freely. A basket of food might be shared with a struggling family, or a woman might step in to help care for children when another fell ill. These bonds were not just practical, they carried emotional strength. In times of hardship, the knowledge that someone nearby would lend a hand gave women comfort and reassurance. Community became a form of resilience, softening the weight of daily responsibilities. Friendship among women carried a special significance. While society placed limits on their public roles, private companionship offered a space of honesty and relief. Women visited each other's homes, sharing stories over sewing or small meals. Laughter, whispered conversations, and shared struggles built bonds that lightened the burdens of daily life. These friendships were often unrecorded in history, yet they were vital. They gave women room to express themselves beyond the roles of wife, mother, or daughter. Within these safe circles, women could find encouragement, sympathy, and joy. These quiet moments of connection sustained spirits, reminding them that they were not alone in their challenges. Social gatherings reflected both duty and companionship. Religious events, community celebrations, and seasonal festivals brought neighbors together. Women played central roles in these gatherings, preparing food, organizing details, and ensuring traditions were upheld. While such events carried social expectations, they also created moments of lightness. Music, storytelling, and shared meals offered breaks from routine. For women, these gatherings strengthened friendships, reinforcing bonds that carried over into daily life. A laugh shared during a festival, or a kind word exchanged after prayer, might echo for weeks afterward, lifting spirits during more difficult days. Community gatherings, though modest, became pillars of connection. Markets were another place where women built relationships. Beyond trading goods, markets were spaces of conversation where women exchanged news, advice, and encouragement. These interactions created a sense of belonging that stretched beyond the household. Even brief exchanges with familiar faces strengthened the fabric of community life. Markets were noisy, crowded, and full of movement, but within them, women formed networks of support that extended far beyond the act of buying and selling. Each encounter reinforced the idea that survival was not only individual, but shared. Community thrived in these busy spaces, carried by women's presence and participation. Mutual aid was essential in times of hardship. When illness struck, neighbors might bring food, help with chores, or sit with children so mothers could rest. During childbirth, women often gathered to provide comfort and assistance, their presence easing fear and offering strength. These acts of solidarity reflected more than kindness, they were survival strategies. No household could endure entirely alone, and women understood this deeply. Their willingness to support one another ensured that burdens were shared, making challenges more bearable. These unseen acts of care reveal a history not written in books, but lived in quiet gestures of compassion. Even leisure was often communal. Sewing circles, quilting bees, and storytelling evenings brought women together in shared activity. While their hands worked steadily, their conversations flowed freely, weaving bonds as tightly as the fabric before them. These gatherings created joy, turning labor into companionship. They also passed knowledge between generations, as younger women learned skills while listening to stories of older ones. Within these circles, history and memory were preserved, spoken softly from one voice to another. Such gatherings, though ordinary, were treasures of community life, shaping not only material objects, but also emotional connection. Religious communities offered another layer of friendship and support. Women often organized gatherings, taught children, and maintained connections within these groups. These roles gave them meaningful participation in collective life, reinforcing values of patience, modesty, and care. Beyond rituals, these spaces offered encouragement and fellowship. Shared faith created bonds that went deeper than circumstance, allowing women to support one another through both hardship and joy. These communities reflected a balance between expectation and empowerment, giving women places where their contributions were valued and their presence felt. For children, community life provided a sense of belonging. Women ensured that children were included in gatherings, celebrations, and traditions. Through these experiences, Young people learned not only practical skills, but also values of cooperation, kindness, and respect. Mothers and neighbors alike contributed to this education, weaving children into the fabric of community. These shared experiences created continuity, connecting generations to one another. Women's efforts ensured that traditions endured, carried forward in both memory and practice. Their work was not only for the present, but also for the future, building strong ties that would outlast them. The emotional support offered by communities cannot be overstated. Women facing loss, illness, or poverty found solace in the presence of others. A kind word, a listening ear, or a simple act of help could ease pain and restore hope. These gestures did not erase hardship, but they made it more bearable. Communities carried one another, ensuring that individuals were never completely alone. Women were central to this support, offering patience, empathy, and endurance. Their contributions were rarely celebrated publicly, but they formed the backbone of social life, preserving humanity within difficult circumstances. Through all these connections, women built resilience not only for themselves, but for their families and communities. Their friendships, their acts of care, and their willingness to share burdens created stability where otherwise there might have been despair. This quiet labor of connection was as essential as physical work, binding people together in ways that sustained survival. Community and friendship were not luxuries, they were necessities, shaped by women's constant effort and compassion. To walk through the 19th century with them is to see a world where connection was strength, and where friendship carried weight equal to bread, warmth, or shelter. Seasonal traditions provided some of the most memorable moments of community life. Women prepared homes for harvest festivals, winter gatherings, and religious celebrations, each event requiring countless small efforts. They baked bread, preserved fruits, and crafted decorations that turned ordinary spaces into places of joy. These traditions were more than rituals. They created continuity, linking past generations with the present. Women ensured these customs endured, teaching younger members their meanings while shaping shared identity. Even the smallest gatherings carried warmth, giving people a sense of belonging. For many women, these traditions represented both duty and delight, moments where effort transformed into joy for the entire community. Community bonds also revealed themselves during times of crisis. Floods, poor harvests, or outbreaks of illness placed heavy burdens on households. Yet when hardship struck, neighbors often came together, pooling resources to protect one another. Women took leading roles in this support, preparing food for affected families, caring for the sick, or organizing supplies. These acts of solidarity reflected resilience, rooted in compassion. In moments when survival seemed fragile, it was women's willingness to step forward that strengthened communities. Their presence reminded others that hardship was never faced alone, but endured collectively. The strength of communities lay not in wealth, but in the care woven into daily acts of service. Friendships often crossed generations, linking women of different ages in bonds of guidance and trust. Older women provided advice and shared memories, while younger women offered energy and fresh perspectives. These interwoven connections ensured that wisdom was not lost, but passed down quietly, shaping both individuals and groups. A grandmother's story might live on in a young girl's heart, carried into her own adulthood. A neighbor's advice on cooking or sewing might echo in countless households for years. These threads of connection, though invisible, formed strong fabric, binding communities together across time. Through friendship, history lived not in books, but in daily conversations and shared experiences. Work itself became a communal activity. Women often gathered to spin, weave, or prepare food in groups, transforming labor into companionship. The rhythm of hands working side by side made heavy tasks lighter. Conversations flowed freely, mixing laughter with advice, sorrow with comfort. These gatherings revealed the human side of labor, showing how even repetitive tasks could carry meaning when shared. For many women, these moments were treasured. They were chances to connect beyond their own households, to feel part of something larger than themselves. Work, though demanding, became an avenue for connection, carrying not only material results, but also emotional nourishment. Markets, festivals, and community events also provided opportunities for women to showcase their skills. Handmade goods, carefully prepared foods, or finely sewn garments became sources of pride as well as livelihood. These contributions earned respect and reinforced women's roles as providers. Beyond the exchange of goods, such events were social showcases, reminding communities of the care and creativity women brought to daily life. Each crafted item or prepared dish was more than a product, it was a symbol of dedication, patience, and resourcefulness. In sharing these works, women extended their influence, enriching communities with both sustenance and culture. Hospitality was another way women strengthened bonds. Inviting neighbors for tea, sharing bread after prayer, or offering shelter during storms all created trust. These acts of generosity reflected values of kindness and reciprocity, ensuring that communities remained close-knit. A single act of welcome could ripple outward, inspiring others to do the same. Hospitality required effort, but it also reinforced women's dignity as caretakers, not just of households, but of social harmony. Through these gestures, women built bridges of friendship that endured long after the tea had cooled or the bread had been eaten. The memory of kindness often outlived the moment itself. Children played an important role in community bonds, often carrying friendships from household to household. Women encouraged these ties, knowing they would shape the next generation of trust and cooperation. Children learned to share, to respect elders, and to participate in traditions, all guided by women's influence. By fostering these connections, women ensured that community life remained vibrant. Their presence in children's lives extended beyond their own households, shaping the future of entire villages and towns. Through children's laughter, games, and learning, communities felt renewed, reminded of hope even in difficult times. Women were the quiet architects of this renewal, nurturing both present and future bonds. The resilience of women's friendships was also tested by distance. Migration, work, or marriage sometimes separated close companions. Letters became lifelines, carrying affection across miles. Women poured care into their words, describing daily life, offering encouragement, or recalling shared memories. Though distance was painful, these letters preserved bonds, ensuring that friendship endured. The patience of waiting for replies reflected both longing and loyalty. Even when separated, women found ways to remain connected, proving that friendship could survive beyond physical presence. Their words carried warmth, offering comfort across landscapes, stitching hearts together through ink and paper. Women's role in maintaining community also extended to conflict resolution. When tensions arose, they often acted as mediators, using patience and persuasion to restore harmony. Their influence was subtle, but it helped prevent small disputes from growing larger. By encouraging forgiveness and cooperation, women preserved the stability of communities. These acts rarely received recognition, but their effects were lasting. The quiet work of keeping peace was as essential as feeding families or maintaining homes. It was another dimension of women's unseen labor, one that bound people together with trust and understanding. As we step back from this picture of community and friendship, we see that women's lives were deeply interwoven with one another. Their bonds created resilience, their kindness preserved hope, and their shared efforts sustained households and societies alike. While history often records battles and politics, the true strength of the 19th century was also found in kitchens, sewing circles, markets, and gatherings where women connected. Their friendships were more than companionship, they were lifelines, threads of humanity that bound communities into something stronger than hardship. To reflect on their lives is to recognize that survival itself was often a collective act, carried on the shoulders of women who built trust and belonging through the simplest acts of care. Faith was a quiet anchor in the 19th century, shaping how women endured the demands of daily life. While work, family, and community consumed much of their time, religious reflection gave them structure and meaning. Prayer, gatherings, and simple devotions reminded women that life carried a rhythm beyond survival alone. In many communities, women were seen as the keepers of moral order within their homes. They guided children with patience, encouraging gratitude, kindness, and discipline. These values were not just cultural but spiritual, tied to belief in a higher purpose. Faith gave women strength to persevere, reminding them that their work had meaning beyond immediate tasks, that endurance itself could be a form of devotion. Religious gatherings often provided rare opportunities for women to step outside their homes, while still fulfilling respected roles. Weekly services, community prayers, or seasonal celebrations became times of connection as well as reflection. Women prepared for these moments with care, dressing modestly and guiding their children to behave respectfully. Within these gatherings, women were not only participants but also teachers, setting examples for younger generations. The sense of belonging, of being part of something greater, carried deep comfort. Even when struggles weighed heavily, these gatherings reminded women that hardship was shared, that others carried burdens too, and that patience was strengthened in unity. At home, faith shaped daily routines in subtle but enduring ways. Women often began and ended their days with prayers or quiet moments of reflection. Before meals, families gave thanks for sustenance, recognizing that food was not merely the result of labor but a blessing provided through the will of the Almighty. Bedtime became a time for simple lessons, where mothers reminded children of moral stories or recited verses to soothe them into sleep. These practices wove spiritual awareness into the fabric of ordinary life, ensuring that devotion was not confined to specific days or places, but lived out in daily patterns. For women, these small acts were both duties and comforts, grounding them in faith while carrying them through long days of labor. Religious education was another area where women played important roles. Even with limited formal schooling, many ensured that children learned prayers, sacred texts, or moral stories. Mothers and grandmothers became the first teachers of devotion, guiding younger members of the household in practices that shaped identity and discipline. These lessons, passed orally or through repetition, were preserved across generations. Women saw this responsibility as essential, a way to anchor children in values that would guide them throughout life. Though their work was often invisible to outsiders, its effects were lasting, woven deeply into character and community. The home became both a school and a sanctuary, where faith and reflection blended with daily chores. Communities often relied on women to organize religious events or acts of charity. Whether preparing food for gatherings, caring for the sick, or supporting neighbors in need, women translated belief into action. These acts of service were not merely social duties, they were seen as extensions of faith, ways of living devotion through care and compassion. In many towns and villages, women's quiet efforts kept traditions alive and communities connected. Their presence in these roles demonstrated that faith was not only about words or rituals, but about living with patience, kindness, and perseverance in the face of challenges. In this way, religion became not just personal, but profoundly communal. Moments of solitude also carried spiritual depth. After a long day of labor, women sometimes found brief stillness by the fire, or while walking through fields, or as children slept nearby. These pauses allowed reflection, offering space to gather thoughts and whisper prayers. Though small, these moments carried healing power, reminding women that their struggles were not unseen. Reflection became a form of resilience, a way of regaining strength before returning to duty. Such practices reveal that even in busy, demanding lives, women created space for spiritual renewal. Their devotion was not dramatic, but steady, woven into the ordinary fabric of life like thread that quietly holds everything together. Seasonal rhythms shaped religious life just as they shaped work. Festivals, fasting periods, or days of communal reflection marked time in ways that brought structure to the year. Women prepared homes and meals for these occasions, ensuring that traditions were honored with care. These observances connected families to the wider community, uniting individuals in shared purpose. For women, the preparation was often exhausting, yet it also carried meaning. It allowed them to contribute visibly to communal life while deepening their own sense of faith. These rhythms created continuity across generations, linking past and present through rituals that reminded people of patience, gratitude, and humility. Music and recitation often enriched spiritual gatherings, and women carried these sounds into their homes. Hymns, chants, or softly recited verses became part of daily memory. Mothers sang to children, embedding devotion in lullabies. Women's voices, though not always public, filled private spaces with reminders of faith. These sounds carried comfort, easing worries and softening fatigue. In this way, devotion was not limited to formal services, but echoed in households, woven into family life. Music and recitation provided not only spiritual guidance, but also emotional calm, a reminder that reflection was as much about peace as it was about discipline. Faith also offered women frameworks for endurance. When illness struck or loss weighed heavily, religious practices provided comfort. Prayer did not erase grief, but it reminded women that suffering was part of the human journey and that patience was a form of strength. This perspective helped women carry burdens without despair. The belief that endurance held meaning gave them courage to face uncertainty. Communities reinforced this through shared words of comfort, showing that resilience was both personal and collective. In this way, faith was not only belief, but a tool of survival, shaping how women met life's inevitable challenges with quiet dignity. Through these many expressions, religion and reflection became sources of order, purpose, and hope. Women carried these practices within households, communities, and their own hearts, weaving devotion into every corner of life. Their faith was not loud or dramatic, but steady and enduring. It sustained them in work, guided them in raising children, and strengthened communities in times of trial. To understand women's lives in the 19th century is to recognize this spiritual foundation, the quiet rhythm of devotion that gave meaning to ordinary days. Reflection, patience, and faith created a framework of resilience, holding families and communities steady across the turning of years. Faith often provided women with a language of comfort during times of separation. When husbands, fathers or sons traveled for work, war, or trade, women turned to prayer for strength and reassurance. Letters exchanged between family members were often filled with religious expressions of hope and patience. For women, faith was not only personal but also relationally, helped them endure distance, loneliness, and uncertainty. These moments show how devotion connected hearts across miles, keeping families united even when physically apart. Religion, in this way, became a bridge, carrying emotional support where physical presence could not reach. Women also expressed their devotion through acts of charity, which became natural extensions of their faith. Helping neighbors in need, feeding travelers, or caring for orphans and widows were seen as duties tied to belief. These acts were not driven by recognition, but by quiet conviction. Communities remembered such kindness long after the food was eaten or the help was given. For women, these acts of service allowed faith to take visible form, reminding others that patience and compassion were part of living devotion. Their generosity often shaped the moral fabric of communities, showing that service was as powerful as prayer in creating bonds of trust. In many places, women's reflections were preserved through writing. Diaries and journals contained prayers, moral lessons, and personal thoughts. Though many of these writings never left private homes, they provide us today with windows into women's spiritual lives. In their pages, we find meditations on daily work, expressions of gratitude, or pleas for strength during hardship. Writing became a form of prayer itself, a way of giving order to thoughts and anchoring the soul in times of uncertainty. These reflections were not meant for an audience, but for personal solace, revealing how women carried faith not only in public rituals, but also in private moments of honesty. Religious festivals often gave women opportunities to display their devotion in community life. Preparing meals for large gatherings, decorating homes or communal spaces, and ensuring that customs were upheld were tasks often carried out by women. These contributions gave festivals their warmth, turning them into living memories for entire communities. The labor was intense, but it was done with a sense of purpose, reinforcing ties between faith, family, and society. For women, the chance to prepare, to serve, and to celebrate was not just duty, it was also joy, a reminder that devotion could be expressed through shared happiness as well as endurance. Faith also gave women a sense of identity within communities. While society sometimes limited their voices in public matters, their moral influence was respected. Women were seen as protectors of values, guiding families through example. Their patience in trials, their dedication to reflection, and their consistency in prayer made them role models. This influence often extended beyond households, shaping neighborhoods and villages through quiet but steady presence. In this way, women's devotion carried weight not through power or authority, but through character. Their lives reminded others that endurance, kindness, and faithfulness could hold communities together even in times of great strain. The relationship between women and faith was not without tension. Some struggled with expectations that seemed heavy or limiting, especially when traditions placed greater burdens on them than on men. Yet many women navigated these struggles by focusing on the aspects of faith that gave them strength. Reflection allowed them to find meaning within limitations, to turn even hardship into an act of patience. These tensions reveal the complexity of faith in daily life. It was both a source of expectation and a source of empowerment, demanding endurance but also offering comfort. Women's resilience in this balance shows the depth of their spiritual lives. Children absorbed faith most directly through their mothers and grandmothers. Women taught them how to pray, guided their behavior, and reminded them of gratitude and humility. These lessons shaped the foundation of children's lives, planting seeds that grew into values carried into adulthood. Women's steady presence ensured that religious practices were not forgotten, even in times of economic or social change. In this way, women preserved continuity, linking generations through devotion. Their quiet teaching was not written into history books, but it shaped societies in lasting ways, ensuring that reflection and faith remained part of daily rhythm. Faith also connected women across social classes. In gatherings, women from different backgrounds often came together, sharing the same prayers or rituals. Though their daily lives differed, devotion created a common ground. Within these moments, women experienced a sense of equality, recognizing one another as participants in shared spiritual practices. These interactions helped soften class divisions, reminding communities that patience, endurance, and devotion were values that transcended wealth or status. Women's presence in these shared spaces highlighted the unifying power of faith, creating bonds that carried beyond ritual into daily acts of kindness and mutual respect. For women, reflection was not always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it was found in the smallest acts, pausing to give thanks before a meal, whispering a prayer while mending clothes, or finding solace in watching the quiet of evening settle over fields or streets. These moments reveal how faith was not confined to formal rituals but infused daily life. Reflection provided meaning in the ordinary, reminding women that their work and endurance carried purpose. It transformed repetitive tasks into acts of devotion, making even the most humble labor part of a greater rhythm. This quiet form of spirituality was steady, resilient, and deeply human. As we close this exploration of religion and reflection, we see that women's faith was not only personal but also communal, not only ritual but also resilience. It carried them through hardship, gave shape to their families, and preserved values across generations. Their devotion was quiet, often invisible to history's grand narratives, yet it sustained entire societies. Through patience, prayer, and reflection, women in the 19th century built foundations of meaning within the ordinary flow of life. To understand them is to recognize that history is not only about events and politics, but also about the silent endurance of faith, carried in the hearts of those who lived simply, steadily, and with devotion. Life in the 19th century was filled with challenges, and for women, these were often constant companions. The demands of work, family, and community weighed heavily, leaving little room for rest. Illnesses spread easily, with limited medical care available, and poverty pressed on households, shaping every choice. Yet, despite these hardships, women displayed extraordinary resilience. They carried burdens with patience, turning survival into an act of quiet strength. Their struggles were rarely celebrated in history books, but they formed the foundation of daily life, proving that endurance was as important as progress. To look at their lives is to see hardship and perseverance walking hand in hand, day after day. Illness was one of the greatest difficulties. Without modern medicine, common diseases often became life-threatening. Women faced the challenge of caring for sick children or elders with limited remedies. Relying on simple treatments passed down through generations, the loss of loved ones was a sorrow that touched nearly every family. Yet women endured, comforting those in pain, managing households during grief, and finding strength in faith and community. Their resilience was not about ignoring sorrow, but about continuing forward despite it, weaving patience and care into the fabric of daily survival. Through illness and loss, they carried households with quiet dignity. Poverty added another layer of struggle. For families with limited resources, Every meal required careful planning, every coin stretched to its fullest. Women became experts in resourcefulness, making clothing last longer, finding creative ways to prepare food, and seeking work to add income. Hunger was a reality many endured, yet women found ways to shield children from its full weight whenever possible. This constant battle against scarcity reflected not only hardship but also remarkable ingenuity. They turned little into enough, relying on patience and steady effort to keep households intact. Their resilience lay in transforming scarcity into survival, making the impossible seem just barely possible. Harsh working conditions were another burden. Women in factories, laundries, or domestic service endured long hours, low pay, and environments that harmed their health. The clatter of machines, the sting of soap on hands, or the endless repetition of tasks weighed heavily. Yet many accepted this labor because it was necessary to sustain families. They endured, often with little recognition, carrying themselves with quiet determination. Their work was invisible to much of society, yet without it, households and communities would falter. The resilience here was found not in comfort, but in persistence, the refusal to give up even when circumstances left little room for hope. Natural hardships also tested women's strength. Harsh winters, failed harvests, or sudden storms could undo months of labor. Women faced these challenges with adaptability, finding ways to preserve food, mend damaged homes, or help neighbors in need. Their resilience was rooted in both preparation and flexibility. They knew that survival depended not on controlling nature, but on adapting to it with patience. Each season brought risks, yet women faced them steadily, trusting in provision while preparing as best they could. Their lives remind us that resilience often means not defeating challenges, but living with them, carrying endurance into every new day. Isolation was another quiet challenge. In rural areas, homes were often far apart, leaving women without daily contact with neighbors or friends. Loneliness weighed heavily, especially during long winters or times of hardship. Yet, even in isolation, women created routines, found comfort in reflection, and drew strength from the presence of family. Letters, when they could be sent, became lifelines. Isolation tested resilience in ways less visible than hunger or illness, but just as deeply. To endure silence and solitude required inner strength, a patience that carried women through days when the world outside felt distant. The burden of expectation added its own weight. Women were judged not only by their work, but also by how well they met society's ideals of modesty, patience, and diligence. This pressure meant that even when exhausted, they felt compelled to maintain appearances of order and calm. The resilience here was psychological as much as physical. Women learned to balance inner struggles with outward composure, ensuring that households seemed steady even when difficulties pressed heavily. This quiet strength is often overlooked, but it was essential to the dignity and survival of families. To carry expectations while enduring hardship required remarkable endurance. Childbearing was both a source of joy and a profound challenge. Without modern medical support, pregnancy and childbirth carried significant risks. Women often relied on midwives and the wisdom of elders, but many still faced danger. The recovery period was short, as household duties demanded their return almost immediately. Yet, despite the risks and exhaustion, women persevered, nurturing new life while continuing daily labor. Their resilience in this area was extraordinary, balancing the fragility of health with the demands of survival. Each birth was both a test of endurance and a renewal of responsibility, woven into the cycle of life that women carried forward. Grief was a constant shadow, whether from loss of children, partners, or parents. In a century where mortality was high, women bore grief repeatedly. Yet their resilience was visible in how they continued, caring for the living even while mourning the departed. They found strength in community, in faith, and in the necessity of daily routines. Their sorrow was deep, but so was their endurance. Through their persistence, families remained intact and life continued. This resilience transformed grief into a form of quiet strength, proving that even in sorrow, women sustained the world around them. Despite all these hardships, women cultivated hope. They found it in children's laughter, in friendships, in faith, and in small joys that softened burdens. Hope did not erase difficulty, but it gave strength to endure it. Resilience was not only survival, it was also the ability to see beyond the struggle, to believe that better days could come. This ability to hold on to hope, even in the face of overwhelming challenges, defined women's lives in the 19th century. Their strength was steady, their endurance unbroken, and their resilience carried generations forward, quietly but powerfully, through history's trials. Another challenge for women in the 19th century was the lack of recognition for their endless labor. Their work sustained households, supported communities, and raised the next generation, yet it was often taken for granted. Records of the time rarely mentioned their names or acknowledged their sacrifices. This invisibility was painful in some ways, yet women responded with quiet resilience. They found satisfaction not in public praise, but in the survival of their families, in the comfort of warm meals, and in the laughter of children. Their reward was often unseen, yet deeply felt. This quiet acceptance reflected a remarkable strength, a recognition that dignity could exist even without acknowledgement. Another hardship was the absence of choice. Many women were bound by circumstances beyond their control, marriages arranged, work forced by poverty, or limited education preventing broader opportunities. Yet even within these narrow boundaries, women displayed resilience. They shaped their households with care, influenced their children with values, and carved small spaces of autonomy in daily life. Their strength lay not in freedom, but in adaptability. They took what was given and turned it into survival, transforming constraints into patterns of endurance. Though history may not have celebrated these efforts, they were victories nonetheless, measured in the quiet success of daily perseverance. Environmental hardships also tested resilience. Harsh winters demanded endless preparation, from storing food to repairing clothing. Summers brought droughts, insects, and long days in the fields. Floods and storms could destroy homes and supplies in an instant. Women bore these cycles with patience, adjusting their labor to match the unpredictability of nature. They prepared remedies for sickness in winter, dried food for storage in summer, and patched homes against rain and cold. Their adaptability made survival possible, even when nature seemed harsh. Their resilience was rooted in awareness, in constant preparation, and in faith that provision would come despite difficulties. The strain of overwork was another challenge. Women's days began before sunrise and often stretched long into the night. They carried double burdens: domestic duties and economic contributions outside the home. Exhaustion was constant, yet they rarely had time to rest. Despite fatigue, they pressed on, driven by necessity and responsibility. This resilience was physical as much as mental, a testimony to human endurance. Their strength was not in grand gestures, but in the repetition of small, essential tasks performed tirelessly. Though history often overlooks such labor, it was the quiet backbone of 19th century society, sustained by women's unending effort. For many, Resilience was also rooted in community. Women leaned on neighbors, family, and friends during difficult times, exchanging support and sharing resources. These networks turned hardship into something bearable, reminding women that survival was not only individual but collective. Borrowing flour, caring for a sick child, or offering comfort during grief became acts of resilience in themselves. Women's willingness to help one another ensured that no family was entirely alone in its struggles. This communal strength reveals that resilience was not only personal endurance, but also the ability to stand together, to weave survival from the bonds of trust and compassion. Spiritual reflection gave women resilience that reached beyond the physical. Faith reminded them that endurance had meaning, that patience was a form of strength, and that hardship was not without purpose. Prayer and reflection provided calm in times of uncertainty, guiding women through illness, grief, and poverty. This resilience was inward, shaped by conviction and trust. It gave women the ability to endure quietly, without despair, and to continue even when circumstances seemed overwhelming. Their faith did not remove challenges, but it transformed how they carried them, giving dignity to lives often marked by hardship. The resilience of women was also seen in their creativity. They turned scraps of cloth into quilts, empty spaces into gardens, and meager supplies into nourishing meals. This creativity was more than skill, it was survival shaped by imagination. Women found ways to make life not only bearable but meaningful, even within scarcity. Their ability to create comfort from little was a form of quiet triumph. It proved that resilience was not only endurance, but also the ability to bring light into difficult circumstances. Creativity became a companion to patience, allowing women to leave beauty in the midst of hardship. Another layer of resilience lay in how women preserved culture and tradition despite hardship. Songs, stories, and rituals were passed down even in times of scarcity. Women ensured that children learned not only survival skills, but also the values, histories, and identities that defined their communities. This cultural resilience provided strength that went beyond material needs, reminding families who they were and where they came from. In preserving these traditions, women gave meaning to endurance, ensuring that survival was not only physical, but also spiritual and cultural. Their resilience was a bridge, carrying heritage through the storms of the century. Resilience was also tested by rapid social and economic change. Industrialization, migration, and shifting roles disrupted traditional patterns. Women had to adapt to new realities: factories instead of fields, crowded cities instead of villages, wage labor instead of subsistence. These transitions demanded flexibility, forcing women to balance old expectations with new demands. Their resilience shone in their ability to adapt without losing the essence of their responsibilities. They carried tradition forward while embracing change, ensuring that households remained steady in an uncertain world. This adaptability was as vital as physical endurance, a reminder that resilience often means moving with the times without losing oneself. As we step back from these challenges, one truth emerges clearly: resilience was the defining quality of women's lives in the 19th century. It was not dramatic or loudly proclaimed, but woven into daily existence. Women endured illness, poverty, grief, and endless labor, yet they carried themselves with patience and quiet strength. Their resilience kept families alive, sustained communities, and preserved culture through hardship. Though history often overlooked their struggles, their endurance shaped the very structure of society. To remember their resilience is to honor the countless women who carried the weight of the century with grace, leaving behind legacies of survival, hope, and perseverance. As we come to the end of this quiet journey, let us pause to reflect on the lives we have gently explored. Women in the 19th century lived within worlds shaped by expectation, responsibility, and labor. Their stories were not filled with loud victories or dramatic triumphs, but with the steady rhythm of endurance. Through work, family, community, and faith, they wove resilience into daily life. Their influence stretched beyond their households, quietly shaping generations and preserving societies through their constancy. The patterns we have traced reveal that history is not only found in great battles or grand inventions, it is also found in kitchens where meals were prepared with patience, in fields where hands worked tirelessly, in schools where children learned their first letters, and in quiet prayers whispered at night. These small, ordinary moments were the true threads of history, carried forward by women whose names we may never know, but whose lives sustained entire communities. To understand the 19th century, we must look not only at its machines, wars, and leaders, but also at the lives of those who carried its weight in silence. Women bore burdens without recognition, yet their efforts gave structure to societies in times of change. Their labor was the invisible foundation on which history rested. Their patience, the unseen force that carried generations into the future. In exploring their lives, we see not only hardship, but also strength. We see the creativity that turned scarcity into survival, the kindness that built community bonds, and the devotion that gave meaning to labor. Their resilience was not loud but enduring, not celebrated but constant. This quiet strength is itself a lesson, reminding us that dignity can exist even within limitation, and that endurance itself is a form of greatness. The lives of these women remind us that history is made not only by those in power, but by countless ordinary individuals. Every patch sewn on clothing, every story told to a child, every shared meal between neighbors carried significance. These moments may seem small, but they formed the heartbeat of the century. Without them, survival would not have been possible. Their strength was the strength of continuity, of keeping families, traditions, and communities alive in the face of hardship. As we look back, it becomes clear that women's contributions were far greater than often recognized. They did not simply endure history, they made it. Their work, their patience, their devotion ensured that the world moved forward even when their efforts remained unspoken. To remember them is to remember the true depth of human resilience, found not in fame but in the quiet persistence of daily life. Closing our journey tonight, let us carry with us a sense of gratitude for the unseen labor of the past. These women remind us that strength often lies in silence, that endurance shapes history as much as invention or war. Their stories call us to honor the ordinary, to recognize the extraordinary power within daily acts of patience and care. Thank you for joining this calm exploration, for walking gently through history as we looked into the lives of women in the 19th century. May the images we have explored stay with you like soft echoes, reminding you of resilience, patience, and quiet strength. And as you prepare to rest, know that our next journey will take us into another corner of the past. In the next story, we will ask a simple but intriguing question. What did medieval knights do when they weren't fighting? It is a tale of routines, duties, and quiet moments that may surprise you. Until then, may you find peace in rest, and may these calm reflections guide you gently towards sleep. Thank you for listening tonight, and may we meet again in the next quiet story of boring history for sleep.